December 12, 1942, dawn off Cape Esperance. Commander Yasuhiko Yasukawa, intelligence officer aboard destroyer Kawakaze, stared at the floating wreckage of PT-44 as morning light revealed what had sunk his squadron's flagship 6 hours earlier. The boat was plywood, 80 feet of mahogany and spruce planking that had somehow carried torpedoes capable of destroying a 2,700-ton destroyer. This was impossible. His commanders had dismissed the American motor torpedo boats as nuisances, fast perhaps, but harmless against steel warships armed with 100mm guns and trained crews. Yet Teruzuki, the pride of the Akizuki class with her 8 dual-purpose guns and 263-man complement, now rested 800 meters below in Iron Bottom Sound. The plywood wreckage told the story his superiors wouldn't want to hear: wooden boats with 41-knot speed, radar equipment mounted on a small mast, 4 torpedo tube mounts clearly visible, Packard engine nameplates still legible on power plants delivering 4,500 horsepower total. These weren't nuisances. They were destroyers' nightmare. How had Admiral Tanaka's invincible Tokyo Express, which had run supplies to Guadalcanal unopposed for 4 months, been broken by boats built in 60 hours? The answer floated before him in splintered mahogany and would change Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer doctrine forever. 6 hours earlier, December 11, 1942, 1830 hours. Shortland Islands, Anchorage, 300 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. 6 destroyers of Rear Admiral Raizō Tanaka's destroyer squadron, 2 prepared to depart on a mission the Americans called the Tokyo Express and the Japanese labeled more honestly rat transportation. For 4 months, these high-speed nighttime supply runs had sustained Japanese forces on Guadalcanal despite overwhelming American air superiority during daylight. Tonight's cargo, drums of rice, rifle ammunition, and 600 reinforcements would travel 300 miles down the slot through New Georgia Sound, deliver at Tassafaronga Beach before dawn, and return to Shortland before Henderson Field's aircraft could intercept at first light. The operation had worked 47 times since August. Admiral Tanaka saw no reason it would fail on the 48th. Tanaka's flagship Teruzuki represented the cutting edge of Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer design. Commissioned just 4 months earlier, in August 1942, the Akizuki-class destroyer stretched 440 feet and displaced 2,701 tons, nearly as large as some light cruisers. 800mm dual-purpose guns in 4 twin turrets gave her exceptional anti-aircraft firepower, the reason for her existence. B-17 bombers from Henderson Field had devastated slower transports attempting daylight supply runs. Teruzuki was purpose-built to shoot them down. Her 33-knot top speed, powered by 2-shaft Campon-geared turbines producing 52,000 shaft horsepower, made her fast enough to reach Guadalcanal and escape before dawn. Her 263-man crew had trained for years in the art the Imperial Japanese Navy had perfected: night combat. The Tokyo Express existed because conventional logistics had failed. After the August 7, 1942 American landings seized Guadalcanal's airfield and renamed it Henderson Field, Japanese commanders faced an impossible equation. Their 25,000 soldiers on the island needed food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Slow cargo vessels could deliver tonnage, but would be annihilated by Henderson Field's aircraft during daylight transit. Fast destroyers could outrun daylight, making round trips in a single night, but carried only a fraction of a transport's cargo and consumed 1/3 of the Imperial Navy's total monthly fuel allocation doing it. The Japanese chose destroyers. They had no choice. Guadalcanal had become, in one staff officer's assessment, a black hole for Japan's precious resources. Admiral Tanaka had run this gauntlet 47 times and earned a reputation as Tenacious Tanaka, the man who made the impossible routine. His doctrine was simple: depart Shortland at sunset, transit the slot at maximum speed through darkness, arrive Guadalcanal after midnight, offload cargo using small boats or simply rolling supply drums overboard for troops to retrieve, and withdraw before first light exposed his destroyers to American aircraft. The Americans controlled the daylight, Tanaka owned the night. His destroyer crews trained incessantly in darkness operations, visual detection using binoculars, starshell illumination, searchlight tactics, torpedo firing by bearing and range estimates. Japanese lookouts could spot destroyer-sized targets at 12,000 yards on moonless nights, a capability American sailors couldn't match. In naval battles off Guadalcanal, Savo Island in August, Cape Esperance in October, the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November, Japanese destroyers had demonstrated shocking proficiency in night combat, sinking cruisers and destroyers with long-lance torpedoes before American radar operators even understood what was happening. But the cost was mounting. Tanaka had lost destroyers, Fubuki at Cape Esperance, Udachi and Ayanami in the November naval battles. Each loss removed irreplaceable ships from a navy already stretched across the Pacific. Destroyer construction took months, training crews took years. The Americans, conversely, seemed to have infinite ships. Still, the mission continued because the alternative was starvation. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were already on half rations, sometimes less. Without the Tokyo Express, the campaign would collapse within weeks. December 11's run carried special urgency. The naval battle of Guadalcanal 2 weeks earlier had been catastrophic. 2 Japanese battleships engaged American cruisers and destroyers in point-blank night combat, and while battleship Hiei had hammered the American formation, Dawn had caught her damaged and unable to withdraw. Henderson Field's aircraft sank her the next day. Kirishima followed a night later. The loss of 2 battleships to sustain 1 island garrison was unsustainable, yet Imperial General Headquarters refused to abandon Guadalcanal. So Tanaka ran supplies. Again. At 1900 hours, Destroyer Squadron 2 weighed anchor. Teruzuki led, followed by Naganami, Makinami, Kuroshio, Oyashio, and Kagero. Each destroyer carried supply drums lashed to deck and soldiers packed below. The formation turned southeast and accelerated to 30 knots. Estimated arrival at Tassafaronga, 0 hours 30 minutes, December 12. Estimated withdrawal completion, 3 hours 30 minutes. Dawn would break at 6 hours 0 minutes, providing a comfortable 2-hour margin before Henderson Field's fighters could reach them. What Admiral Tanaka didn't know, 5 plywood boats were already waiting in Iron Bottom Sound. And they had radar. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2 had arrived at Tulagi in late November 1942, and by December 11, the reality of PT boat operations in the South Pacific was decidedly unglamorous. The 5 boats operational that night, PT-37, PT-40, PT-48, PT-44, and PT-110, sat moored under camouflage nets in a primitive forward base carved from jungle. Time 0.5s, their crews slept in tents on shore, worked maintenance details in oppressive humidity, and dealt with constant mechanical problems that came from running high-performance engines in tropical conditions. The Japanese owned the night at sea. PT boats owned mosquito-infested shoreline and the doubtful honor of intercepting destroyers with plywood. Because plywood was precisely what they were. The Elco 80-foot design that made up Squadron 2's boats represented American mass production philosophy applied to naval warfare. Build them fast, build them cheap, make them expendable. Each hull consisted of 2 layers of plywood over mahogany frames, a 3/8-inch inner layer of spruce, then a 3/4-inch outer layer of mahogany, creating barely over an inch of wood between crew and ocean. Total length, 80 feet. Beam, 20 feet 8 inches. Displacement, 56 tons fully loaded, less than the weight of a single long-lance torpedo. The construction process at Elco's Bayonne, New Jersey factory took approximately 60 hours from keel laying to launch. Destroyers like Teruzuki required months. PT boats were furniture, really, high-speed torpedo-carrying furniture. The vulnerability was obvious to anyone who looked. A single shell hit would splinter the plywood hull into kindling. Fire was the nightmare scenario. 3 Packard 4M 2500 marine engines consumed 100-octane aviation gasoline, the same fuel that powered fighter planes stored in tanks amidships. Battle damage that punctured a fuel tank would turn the boat into a floating bomb. The crew had no armor protection whatsoever. They operated exposed on deck, trusting speed and darkness for survival. In the Philippines campaign earlier that year, Japanese aircraft and surface vessels had destroyed multiple PT boats with casual efficiency. Some U.S. Navy officers privately called them plywood coffins. Others were blunter, expendable. Yet the Packard engines gave them one undeniable advantage: speed. Each V-12 supercharged power plant generated 1,500 horsepower, engines originally designed for aircraft, adapted for marine use, feeding on aviation gasoline to produce performance no diesel-powered vessel could match. 3 engines per boat meant 4,500 total horsepower, driving 56 tons through water. In calm conditions, properly maintained PT boats could sustain 41 knots, with burst speeds touching 43 to 44 knots. This made them faster than any destroyer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Faster, in fact, than most destroyers in any navy. The tactical implications were profound. For the first time in the Pacific War, the attackers could outrun the defenders. The crews were as young as the boats were fragile. Lieutenant Lester H. Gamble, commanding PT-37 and serving as the night's tactical coordinator, was 26 years old. Lieutenant Robert C. Walk on PT-40 was 24. Lieutenant Stilly B. Taylor commanded PT-48 at age 25. Lieutenant Frank Freeland on PT-44 was 27, making him the old man of the group. Lieutenant Edward H. Kremer on PT-110 had just turned 23. Most enlisted crew were younger still, 19, 20, 21 years old. Training had been 8 weeks at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron's training center in Melville, Rhode Island: navigation, torpedo tactics, engine maintenance, gunnery, and the peculiar art of high-speed boat handling in darkness. 8 weeks to learn skills that destroyer crews spent years perfecting. Armament was equally modest. Each boat carried 4 Mark 8 torpedoes in fixed tubes, 2 per side, angled slightly outward. These were the same 21-inch torpedoes the U.S. Navy had used since 1911, steam-powered, with 385-pound TNT warheads and a theoretical range of 16,000 yards. In practice, PT boats launched at 800 yards or less, because the Mark 8's 27-knot speed made long-range shots pointless. Targets could evade leisurely. Defensive armament consisted of twin .50 caliber machine guns in open mounts, effective against aircraft or other small boats but laughably inadequate against destroyer armor. Later boats would receive 20mm Oerlikon cannons and even 37mm guns. But in December 1942, Squadron 2's boats had .50 calibers and optimism. The mission brief for December 11 was straightforward: Tokyo Express run expected, 6 destroyers inbound, intercept and attack with torpedoes. The odds were not promising. 5 wooden boats, each with 4 torpedoes of questionable reliability, against 6 steel destroyers with 800mm guns apiece. Basic mathematics suggested this would end with plywood debris floating in iron-bottomed Sound, the stretch of water between Guadalcanal and Savo Island already littered with so many sunken ships that it had earned its grim nickname. But Squadron 2 had one asset Admiral Tanaka's destroyers lacked: one piece of technology that would transform the engagement from suicide mission into achievable ambush. 3 boats, PT-37, PT-40, and PT-48, had received experimental SO-type radar sets in recent weeks. The radar was crude, the displays difficult to interpret, the operators learning on the job, but it could detect destroyer-sized targets at 15 miles in total darkness. And December 11 would be very dark indeed. At 22 hours, 30 minutes, all 5 boats started engines. The distinctive roar of 15 Packard V-12s shattered the evening quiet. Crews cast off mooring lines. PT-37 led the formation out of Tulagi Harbor toward Iron Bottom Sound, engines throttled back to cruising speed, conserving fuel for the high-speed attack run that would come. Behind them, Tulagi's radio operators relayed final intelligence: 6 destroyers, estimated speed 30 knots, bearing 315 degrees, range 40 miles, and closing. Someone on PT-44 had painted a cartoon mosquito on the bow with the caption, "Bloodsucker." Tonight they'd learn if mosquitoes could kill giants. The Mark 8 torpedo riding in PT-37's starboard tube had been designed in 1911, the same year the Titanic was fitting out in Belfast and the Qing dynasty still ruled China. 31 years later, it remained the U.S. Navy's standard torpedo for small craft, not because it was effective, but because replacing it would require admitting the entire pre-war torpedo development program had failed. The Mark 8 was a relic, and everyone in Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2 knew it. The specifications told the story. Length 21 inches, diameter 162 inches overall. Propulsion, steam turbine powered by alcohol combustion, creating a visible wake trail. Speed 27 knots maximum, less if the torpedo had been in storage. Range 16,000 yards theoretically, though PT boats never launched beyond 1,000 yards because evading a 27-knot torpedo was trivial for any destroyer captain with functioning eyes. Warhead 385 pounds of TNT. Guidance, gyroscope for directional stability, depth engine for running depth, both prone to failure. The Mark 8's reputation for duds, circular runs, and premature detonations had cost American submarines countless kills in the war's first year. PT boat crews had no reason to expect better performance. But the Mark 8's greatest liability was speed. At 27 knots, it was slower than many of the targets it was designed to sink. A destroyer running at 30 knots could pull away from a Mark 8 chasing it. Even if the torpedo was fired ahead of the target on an intercept course, the slow speed gave alert lookouts ample time to spot the wake, call for evasive maneuvers, and watch the torpedo pass harmlessly. American torpedo men calculated that Mark 8 shots needed to be launched within 800 yards, on near-perfect intercept angles, against targets that hadn't seen the PT boat. In short, surprise was mandatory. Second chances didn't exist. Standing in devastating contrast was the weapon aboard Tanaka's destroyers, the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, the finest naval torpedo in the world. Where the Mark 8 used steam, the Long Lance used pure oxygen combustion, creating 3 times the energy with no visible wake. Speed 48 to 50 knots, nearly double the Mark 8. Range 22,000 yards at top speed, or 40,400 yards at reduced speed settings, the latter being 23 miles beyond visual range even in daylight. Warhead 1,080 pounds of Type 97 explosive, 2.8 times heavier than the Mark 8's charge. A single Long Lance hit could break a heavy cruiser's keel. 2 hits meant certain sinking. The Long Lance had already earned its fearsome reputation in night battles throughout 1942. At Savo Island in August, Japanese cruisers launched 51 Long Lances at point-blank range, sinking 4 Allied cruisers and killing 1,077 sailors in 32 minutes. The Americans never saw the torpedoes coming, no wakes, no warning, just sudden catastrophic explosions below the waterline. At Tassafaronga, on November 30, just 11 days before tonight's mission, Tanaka's destroyers had ambushed 5 American cruisers with Long Lance spreads, sinking 1 and crippling 3 others while losing only 1 destroyer. The psychological impact was crushing. American sailors now feared Japanese torpedoes the way infantry feared artillery, sudden, invisible, unstoppable. The technical gap was humiliating. Japan, a nation America considered industrially inferior, had produced a torpedo that outranged, outran, and outpunched anything in the U.S. Navy arsenal. American torpedoes were designed by the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, tested in peacetime conditions, and deployed with minimal combat feedback. Japanese torpedoes were designed by engineers who understood that naval warfare in the Pacific would be fought at night at long range, with targets traveling at high speed. The oxygen propulsion system was complex and dangerous. Pure oxygen made loading procedures hazardous and accidental detonations catastrophic. But Japanese crews mastered it through rigorous training. American torpedoes prioritized safety and simplicity. Japanese torpedoes prioritized lethality. For PT boats, this disparity created a nightmare tactical problem. They carried 4 chances to hit, 4 Mark 8 torpedoes that needed to be launched within 800 yards of a target capable of shooting back with 800mm guns. If even one torpedo malfunctioned, if one ran deep or shallow, if one's gyroscope failed, the odds dropped further. And they were attacking destroyers armed with long lances that could engage at 22,000 yards with wakeless torpedoes traveling at 50 knots. It was asymmetric warfare, but asymmetric in the wrong direction. Lieutenant Gamble knew the statistics. Squadron 2 had fired 43 Mark 8 torpedoes in combat since arriving at Guadalcanal. 3 hits, 7% hit rate. 2 of those hits failed to detonate. The third had damaged a Japanese transport enough that it beached itself on Guadalcanal's coast rather than sink, a tactical success, but hardly the devastating blow torpedoes were meant to deliver. Yet tonight Gamble and his crews were taking their obsolete torpedoes against Tanaka's destroyer squadron anyway. The mission wasn't optional. The Tokyo Express runs were bleeding American forces at Henderson Field. Someone had to try stopping them, even with 31-year-old torpedoes that shouldn't work. But speed might compensate for firepower, and radar might compensate for range. The question was whether compensation would be enough. The SO-type radar mounted on PT-37's small mast looked unimpressive, a rotating antenna barely 4 feet across connected by cables to a console below deck, where radioman second-class John Claggett sat hunched over a glowing oscilloscope screen. The technology was experimental, temperamental, and represented the most significant tactical advantage PT boats possessed. In December 1942, radar was transforming naval warfare, and Admiral Tanaka's destroyers didn't have it. The SO radar could detect destroyer-sized targets at approximately 15 miles under optimal conditions, less in rough seas or rain, but still far beyond visual range on a dark night. The display showed range and bearing as luminous blips on a circular screen, primitive by later standards, but revolutionary in 1942. Claggett had received perhaps 20 hours of training on radar operation before Squadron 2 deployed to Guadalcanal. He learned by doing, interpreting returns, distinguishing between islands and ships, tracking multiple contacts while PT-37 pitched through waves at 35 knots. It was more art than science, but it worked. Most Imperial Japanese Navy destroyers in December 1942 had no radar whatsoever. The Type 21 air search radar and Type 22 surface search radar were just entering service on the newest capital ships, but installation was slow and operational doctrine undeveloped. Teruzuki, despite being commissioned only 4 months earlier, carried no radar equipment. Her sister ship Niizuki had received radar sets, making her the first Akizuki-class destroyer so equipped. But Teruzuki sailed blind, except for her crew's eyes. In night combat, those eyes were formidable. Imperial Japanese Navy lookouts trained extensively in darkness operations using high-quality binoculars to spot targets at 12,000 yards on clear nights. But electronic detection at 15 miles beat optical detection at 12,000 yards. Mathematics favored the radar. The Japanese had built their entire night combat doctrine around superior visual detection. Destroyer crews spent years training in darkness, learning to use star shells for illumination, searchlights for target acquisition, and Type 93 torpedoes for long-range kills. Lookouts competed for positions based on visual acuity. Men with exceptional night vision received preferential assignments. The Imperial Japanese Navy had won battles at Savo Island, Cape Esperance, and Tassafaronga through mastery of night-fighting techniques that American forces couldn't match. But radar was changing the equation. Electronic eyes didn't need years of training. They didn't fatigue. They weren't blinded by muzzle flashes or searchlights. They simply saw constantly in all directions. The irony was profound. Japan's investment in human training excellence was being rendered obsolete by American investment in technology. The U.S. Navy had entered the war with inferior night combat skills but superior radar. By December 1942, radar-equipped American ships were winning night battles that would have been suicidal 6 months earlier. The Battle of Guadalcanal on November 13–15 had demonstrated this shift. American battleships using radar fire control had engaged Japanese battleships in near-total darkness, landing hits at ranges where visual detection was impossible. Japan's tactical advantage was evaporating. For PT boats, radar meant survival. Without it, approaching 6 destroyers in darkness meant blundering into range of searchlights and 100mm guns, hoping for surprise and likely getting annihilated. With radar, PT boats could track the destroyer's course and speed, calculate optimal intercept positions, approach from unexpected angles, and launch torpedoes before the enemy knew they were present. The engagement transformed from chance encounter to calculated ambush. December 11's conditions amplified the radar advantage. The moon was a waxing crescent, just 4 days past new moon on December 8, providing minimal natural illumination. Cloud cover obscured even that faint light. Sea state was calm, reducing wave clutter on the radar display. Visibility was perhaps 2,000 yards for human eyes under those conditions, enough to avoid collisions, insufficient for tactical advantage. But radar saw clearly. At 22 hours, 59 minutes, Claget's oscilloscope showed 6 distinct contacts bearing 315 degrees, range 12 miles, speed approximately 30 knots. He called the reading to Lieutenant Gamble, who verified the contacts on PT-40's radar, then passed the information to PT-48, 3 boats with electronic eyes, tracking prey that couldn't see them coming. The tactical coordination required was complex. PT boats lacked sophisticated radio equipment. Voice communication was possible but unreliable, easily jammed or overheard. Gamble used brief transmissions to coordinate the attack plan. PT-37 and PT-40 would intercept from the north, approaching on the destroyer's port side. PT-48 and PT-44 would angle in from the south, targeting the starboard flank. PT-110 would remain in reserve, engines at idle, radar tracking the entire engagement, ready to exploit opportunities or rescue survivors. The plan relied on radar tracking to position the boats, speed to reach intercept points before the destroyers passed, and darkness to conceal the approach until torpedo range. Admiral Tanaka, aboard Teruzuki, had no indication PT boats were tracking him. His lookout scanned the darkness for threats, but wooden boats produced minimal visual signatures, no tall masts, no large hull silhouettes, engines low to the water. Radar would have revealed them easily. Visual detection would require luck and perfect conditions. Tanaka had neither. He believed, based on years of successful Tokyo Express runs, that his destroyers owned the night. That confidence was about to be tested by an enemy he couldn't see until too late. At 23 hours, 15 minutes, PT-37 and PT-40 increased speed to 38 knots, racing north to reach intercept position. Packard engines roared, throwing spray across open decks. Crews checked torpedo tubes, charged machine guns, secured loose equipment. The radar showed destroyers closing at 30 knots, range now 8 miles. Geometry was working. Intercept would occur near Cape Esperance in approximately 20 minutes. The impossible was becoming probable. Plywood boats were about to ambush steel destroyers. And the destroyers didn't know it. Clachette watched his scope. 6 blips, unwavering, approaching. No evasive maneuvers, no indication of alarm. Just 6 destroyers steaming confidently toward Guadalcanal, expecting minimal resistance, trusting darkness and their guns. Trusting eyes that couldn't see electrons. Speed had reversed the fundamental equation of Pacific naval warfare. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American vessels could outrun Imperial Japanese Navy warships in open water. The tactical implications were revolutionary. Attackers could dictate engagement range, break contact at will, and exploit hit-and-run tactics that destroyer doctrine had no answer for. The reason was simple. 3 Packard 4M 2500 marine engines produced more power per ton than any destroyer turbine in the world. Each Packard 12 was a masterpiece of American automotive engineering adapted for naval warfare. Originally designed as aircraft engines for high-altitude bombers, the 4M 2500 used a supercharger to compress intake air, increasing power output to 1,500 horsepower per engine at 2,800 RPM. The fuel was 100-octane aviation gasoline, the same high-performance fuel that powered P-38 fighters and B-17 bombers, stored in 3,000-gallon tanks that gave PT boats approximately 500-mile range at cruising speed, far less at combat speed. 3 engines per boat meant 4,500 total horsepower, driving just 56 tons through water. Power-to-weight ratio was extraordinary, 80 horsepower per ton, compared to roughly 20 horsepower per ton for Teruzuki. The result was 41 knots sustained speed in calm seas, with brief burst capability touching 43 to 44 knots when engines were pushed to maximum RPM. Teruzuki's designed speed was 33 knots, achievable only at full power with clean hull and optimal conditions. After months of operations, fouling reduced her effective speed to perhaps 31 to 32 knots. The PT boat's 8-knot advantage meant they could close from any angle, launch torpedoes, and withdraw before destroyers could bring guns to bear effectively. It meant pursuit was futile. Japanese destroyers couldn't catch what they couldn't match for speed. This tactical advantage had emerged accidentally. PT boats were designed for coastal defense and harbor patrol, not open ocean destroyer engagements. The Packard engines were chosen because they were available, powerful, and relatively reliable. The 100-octane fuel requirement was a logistics headache. Aviation gasoline had to be shipped separately from standard naval fuel oil, stored carefully to prevent volatility issues, and handled with extreme caution because vapors were explosively flammable. But the performance justified the complexity. No diesel engine of equivalent weight could match the power output. No destroyer could match the acceleration. PT boats could go from idle to 40 knots in under 2 minutes, while destroyer turbines needed 5 minutes or more to reach full power from cold start. Lieutenant Gamble understood the tactical geometry perfectly. At 23 hours, 15 minutes, with 6 destroyers 8 miles northwest traveling at 30 knots, he calculated intercept requirements. PT-37 and PT-40 needed to reach a position 2,000 yards off the destroyer's port beam before the formation passed Cape Esperance. The boats accelerated to 38 knots, angling northwest to cut across the destroyer's projected path. Travel time, 18 minutes. Fuel consumption, approximately 300 gallons. Remaining fuel after intercept, enough for attack, withdrawal, and return to Tulagi with minimal reserve. The mathematics was tight but workable. PT-48 and PT-44 angled south, aiming for the destroyer's starboard flank. Their approach was slightly longer, 10 miles at 38 knots, requiring 21 minutes. The plan called for PT-37 and PT-40 to attack first, drawing destroyer attention and fire to the north, while PT-48 and PT-44 exploited the distraction to launch from the south. PT-110 remained in reserve, engines at idle, radar tracking the entire engagement, ready to rescue crews if boats were damaged. It was textbook PT boat doctrine, coordinated attacks from multiple bearings, exploiting speed and surprise, accepting risk because the target was worth it. The doctrine had been developed through bitter experience in the Philippines campaign earlier in 1942. PT boats operating alone were death traps. Destroyers would illuminate them with searchlights, bracket them with 100mm guns, and sink them in minutes. But boats attacking in coordinated sections, timing their approaches to split defensive fire, had better survival odds. The key was simultaneous threats from different bearings. Destroyers couldn't engage north and south simultaneously, guns had traverse limits, fire control directors could track only one target effectively, searchlights illuminated only one sector. Multiple attackers created impossible decisions for destroyer commanders, which threat to engage first. By the time they chose, torpedoes would be in the water. Teruzuki's Captain Tsuneo Orita had no indication the trap was forming. His lookouts scanned darkness, seeing nothing but black water and darker shoreline. His formation maintained 30 knots, supply drums lashed to decks, soldiers packed below in troop spaces. The schedule demanded arrival at Tassafaronga by 0 hours, 30 minutes, just 90 minutes away. Radar would have shown 5 contacts maneuvering at high speed on converging courses. Visual detection showed nothing. The Imperial Japanese Navy's vaunted night combat training, its binoculars with 12-centimeter apertures, its carefully selected lookouts with superior night vision, all useless against an enemy using electronics to track them and plywood to hide. At 23 hours, 33 minutes, PT-37 reached intercept position 2,200 yards off Teruzuki's port beam, speed matched at 30 knots, running parallel to the destroyer formation. Gamble throttled back to reduce engine noise and wake. PT-40 fell in 400 yards astern, maintaining formation. Both boats carried 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, 8 chances total if all tubes functioned properly, which was optimistic given the Mark 8's reputation. Claget's radar showed the destroyer formation clearly now. 6 ships in column, 400-yard spacing, course 135 degrees, speed 30 knots. Range 2,100 yards, still beyond effective visual detection in the darkness. Gamble made his decision at 23 hours, 40 minutes, attack in 5 minutes. The geometry would be optimal, destroyers passing slowly from left to right at 2,000 yards, perfect broadside angle for torpedo launch. PT-48 and PT-44 were in position to the south, waiting for the northern section to initiate. PT-110 confirmed radar contact and readiness to provide support. Everything was positioned. The plywood boats had maneuvered faster than steel destroyers, positioned themselves undetected using radar the destroyers lacked, and were about to attempt the impossible with obsolete torpedoes. Speed had given them the chance. Radar had given them position. Now, Mark 8 torpedoes, designed when Taft was president, would determine whether mosquitoes could actually kill giants or just annoy them. At 23 hours, 45 minutes, Lieutenant Lester Gamble gave the command that would change PT boat doctrine forever. Stand by to fire torpedoes. PT-37 and PT-40 were running parallel to Teruzuki at 2,000 yards, match speeds at 30 knots, invisible in the darkness. The destroyer formation continued southeast, unaware that plywood boats were tracking them with radar and calculating firing solutions with obsolete torpedoes. 8 Mark 8s, 4 per boat, represented the squadron's best chance to prove wooden boats could threaten steel warships. In 55 seconds, the question would be answered. Gamble's torpedo officer, Ensign Henry Brantingham, checked the firing angle one final time. Teruzuki's course was 135 degrees, speed 30 knots, range 1,900 yards, and steady. The Mark 8's 27-knot speed meant a 90-degree firing angle was optimal. Torpedoes would intercept the destroyer's track perpendicular, maximizing hit probability. The gyroscope settings were verified, depth set for 10 feet to run beneath Teruzuki's keel or strike her hull just below the waterline. At 23 hours, 46 minutes, Brantingham fired all 4 torpedoes in a spread pattern, each tube launching 3 seconds apart, creating a 200-yard dispersion pattern. 4 white wakes immediately appeared, angling toward the destroyer formation at 27 knots. PT-40 fired simultaneously, 8 torpedoes total converging on Teruzuki from 1,800 yards. The Mark 8's visible wake was both blessing and curse. It allowed PT boat crews to track torpedo runs visually, confirming they were running true. But it also warned targets. Aboard Teruzuki, a sharp-eyed lookout spotted the wakes at approximately 1,200 yards, 40 seconds from impact. He shouted warning. Captain Arita ordered hard starboard rudder, attempting to turn the destroyer parallel to the torpedo tracks and reduce target profile. At 30 knots, Teruzuki's turning radius was roughly 800 yards. She needed 90 seconds to complete a full turn. The torpedoes would arrive in 40 seconds. The mathematics was brutally simple, insufficient time. 2 Mark 8 torpedoes struck Teruzuki's port side at 23 hours, 47 minutes. The first hit the aft engine room directly beneath the main mast, 485 pounds of TNT detonating against hull plating never designed to withstand torpedo impact. The explosion tore a 20-foot gash in the hull, flooding the engine room instantly and killing the engineering crew on watch. Teruzuki's port propeller shaft seized immediately, speed dropping to 15 knots as the starboard engine struggled alone. The second torpedo struck 30 feet aft, smashing into the fantail and destroying the port propeller and rudder assembly completely. Steering control was lost. The destroyer began listing to port as water poured through both breaches. Damage control teams responded immediately, but the flooding was catastrophic. Hundreds of tons of seawater per minute entering compartments that couldn't be sealed quickly enough. The remaining 6 Mark 8 torpedoes missed. 2 passed ahead of Teruzuki as she turned. 3 ran beneath escorts without detonating, magnetic exploders failing, depth-keeping mechanisms malfunctioning, the familiar litany of Mark 8 unreliability. 1 struck the destroyer Naganami amidships, but failed to detonate, bouncing off the hull and sinking, a dud, joining dozens of other American torpedo failures that would define the war's first 2 years. But 2 hits were enough. Teruzuki was dying. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. Searchlights blazed across the water, sweeping for targets. 100-millimeter guns trained outward, loaded with high-explosive shells, ready to annihilate anything they could illuminate. PT-37 and PT-40 had already begun their withdrawal at the moment torpedoes launched. Both boats accelerated to 41 knots, turning northwest, opening range before searchlights could acquire them. Shells bracketed their wakes, raising waterspouts 50 feet high, but the boats were accelerating away faster than destroyers could pursue. Gamble's crews had survived the attack. PT-44's crew would not. To the south, Lieutenant Frank Freeland had maneuvered PT-44 and PT-48 into position for a follow-up attack. The plan called for them to exploit the confusion created by the northern section's torpedoes, launching from the starboard side while Japanese attention focused north. But Teruzuki's escorts had expanded their searchlight sweeps, and at 23 hours, 49 minutes, a beam caught PT-44 squarely at 600 yards. The boat was fully illuminated, 80 feet of plywood and mahogany, 3 Packard engines, 11 crew exposed on deck, 4 empty torpedo tubes already fired in the confusion. Freeland had launched his torpedoes at Naganami, missing in the darkness. Now he was paying the price. 8 destroyers concentrated fire on PT-44. 100-millimeter guns fired as fast as crews could load, 15 rounds per minute per mount, 120 rounds per minute total when all guns bore. The first salvo straddled PT-44, shells detonating in the water 20 yards to port and starboard. The second salvo hit directly. High-explosive shells designed to destroy aircraft tore through plywood hull as if it were paper. 1 shell struck the forward fuel tank, rupturing 500 gallons of 100-octane gasoline that ignited instantly. Another shell detonated in the engine compartment, disintegrating all 3 Packard engines simultaneously. A third shell hit the crew quarters, killing 5 men instantly. PT-44's crew returned. Fire with twin .50 caliber machine guns, a futile gesture, bullets sparking harmlessly off destroyer armor until the boat exploded in a fireball visible for miles. The entire engagement lasted 90 seconds from illumination to explosion. 11 crew were aboard PT-44. 9 died immediately. 2 were blown clear by the explosion and survived, swimming 4 hours before rescue by PT-110. Lieutenant Frank Freeland was 27 years old when he died commanding a boat that cost $300,000 and lasted 11 months in service. PT-48 escaped by sheer luck. Her commander, Lieutenant Stilly Taylor, had throttled to full speed at the first searchlight, turning south away from the destroyer formation, accepting that his torpedoes would miss rather than closing to effective range and risking PT-44's fate. The decision saved his crew and boat. PT-110 remained at safe distance, radar tracking the chaos, engines idling, waiting to rescue survivors if boats were damaged. The attack was over. PT-37, PT-40, PT-48, and PT-110 withdrew to Tulagi, arriving by 02 hours, 0 minutes, December 12, with minor damage and no casualties. PT-44 was gone. Teruzuki was sinking. Behind them, Admiral Tanaka transferred his flag from Teruzuki to Naganami, wounded by shell splinters when PT torpedoes struck his flagship. Teruzuki's crew fought flooding for 3 hours, counterflooding starboard compartments to correct the list, pumping water from breached compartments, attempting emergency repairs to propulsion. Nothing worked. At 4 hours, 40 minutes, December 12, with the destroyer listing 35 degrees and sinking by the stern, Captain Arita ordered abandon ship. The crew went into the water 800 meters off Cape Esperance. Teruzuki capsized and sank at 4 hours, 48 minutes, settling in Iron Bottom Sound alongside the dozens of other warships that gave the water its name. Of 263 crew, 156 swam to shore, 196 were rescued by other destroyers, and 9 died, including Captain Arita, who went down with his ship. The Tokyo Express continued to Tassafaronga, delivered 220 of 1,200 supply drums. The rest lost when American aircraft strafed them at dawn and withdrew before Henderson Field's fighters could intercept. The mission was technically successful, but Admiral Tanaka had lost his flagship to plywood boats armed with obsolete torpedoes. The impossible had happened, and the wreckage of PT-44, floating at dawn, would tell Japanese intelligence officers everything they feared about the new threat in Iron Bottom Sound. Dawn, December 12, 1942. Commander Yasuhiko Yasukawa stood on Kawakaze's deck, examining the wreckage of PT-44 as it floated off Cape Esperance, and understood immediately that everything Imperial Japanese Navy intelligence believed about American motor torpedo boats was catastrophically wrong. The boat's construction was visible in the shattered hull, plywood, 2 layers of wood planking over mahogany frames, 80 feet long, perhaps 20 feet wide, displacing no more than 60 tons. Yet this fragile craft had carried torpedoes capable of sinking Teruzuki, a 2,700-ton destroyer with 8 dual-purpose guns and 263 trained crew. The wreckage told a story Admiral Tanaka's commanders would not want to hear, but needed to understand. Yasukawa's assessment team catalogued every detail. 3 engine nameplates were recovered from the floating debris, Packard IV M2500 marine engines, 1,500 horsepower each, American automotive engineering adapted for naval use. Simple mathematics, 4,500 total horsepower driving 56 tons, meant extraordinary power-to-weight ratio, explaining the 41-knot speed Japanese lookouts had reported, faster than any destroyer in the fleet. 4 torpedo tube mounts were visible in the wreckage, confirming each boat carried 4 torpedoes. Most critically, a small radar antenna was found mounted on a collapsed mast. The Americans had equipped wooden boats with electronic detection equipment. This explained how PT boats appeared from darkness without warning, positioned perfectly for torpedo attacks, and vanished before searchlights could acquire them. Radar gave them eyes in darkness that years of Japanese night combat training couldn't counter. The intelligence report Yasukawa drafted that morning would reach Combined Fleet Headquarters within 48 hours. Enemy motor torpedo boats represent significant threat to destroyer operations in coastal waters. Plywood construction and small size make visual detection difficult. Speed of 40+ knots exceeds destroyer pursuit capability. Radar equipment allows detection and tracking beyond visual range. Recommend destroyers avoid shallow coastal waters, where PT boats operate. Tokyo Express operations as currently conducted are unsustainable. The strategic cascade was immediate. Tokyo Express run frequency dropped sharply in January 1943. Destroyers that had made 2 or 3 supply runs weekly to Guadalcanal reduced to 1 run, sometimes none. When runs were attempted, destroyers maintained higher speeds, reducing cargo capacity. Delivery efficiency, already marginal, collapsed further. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal, already on starvation rations, received even less. The island that Japanese commanders had called the Black Hole for consuming irreplaceable resources became untenable. On February 1, 1943, Imperial General Headquarters authorized Operation K evacuation. Destroyers would remove 10,652 surviving soldiers over 3 nights, abandoning Guadalcanal after 6 months of combat that cost 31,000 Japanese lives. Teruzuki's sinking had not caused the evacuation directly, but it had demonstrated that the supply line keeping Japanese forces alive was now severed. Admiral Tanaka never commanded destroyers at sea again. The loss of his flagship to wooden boats was viewed as humiliating failure, regardless of the tactical impossibility of defending against radar-guided torpedo attacks in darkness. He was reassigned to shore duties in Burma, far from the action, spending the remainder of the war in administrative roles that wasted his considerable tactical skills. His Tokyo Express runs had delivered thousands of tons of supplies under impossible conditions for 5 months. History would remember him primarily for losing Teruzuki to PT boats, proof that even the finest commanders could not overcome technological disadvantages. For motor torpedo boat Squadron 2, Teruzuki's sinking vindicated the entire PT boat program. The boats were fragile, the torpedoes were obsolete, the mission was dangerous. But the combination of speed, radar, and crew courage could accomplish what conventional forces could not: interdict enemy supply lines in coastal waters where larger ships couldn't operate effectively. PT boat production accelerated throughout 1943. By war's end, 531 PT boats had been built, Elco and Higgins factories running at capacity, producing boats in 60 hours, crewing them with young officers averaging 25 years old, sending them into combat where plywood faced steel and won through speed and electronics. The casualty rate was appalling. 26% of PT boat crew members would become casualties before war's end, but the tactical value was proven. PT 109, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, would be rammed and sunk by destroyer Amagiri in August 1943, making the boats famous. But December 12, 1942 was the night PT boats proved they could sink what they shouldn't damage. Lieutenant Frank Freeland and the 8 crew members who died aboard PT-44 received posthumous recognition, though their sacrifice was overshadowed by later PT boat actions. Freeland's decision to close to torpedo range despite overwhelming firepower disadvantage was exactly what PT boat doctrine demanded. Press the attack, launch torpedoes, accept casualties if mission succeeds. PT-44 had fired 4 torpedoes at Naganami before being destroyed. All 4 missed or malfunctioned, the Mark 8's 7% hit rate remaining consistent, but PT-44's attack had distracted Japanese destroyers long enough for PT-37 and PT-40 to position and fire. Freeland's boat died so Gamble's boat could succeed. 9 men paid with their lives to sink 1 destroyer. The mathematics was brutal but effective. Teruzuki remained hidden for 83 years. On July 10, 2025, the research vessel Nautilus, using remotely operated vehicles Hercules and Atalanta, located the destroyer's wreck at 800 meters depth off Cape Esperance. The hull was severed, stern and main section lying 650 feet apart on the seafloor. The brake pattern confirmed torpedo damage. 2 Mark 8 hits in the stern had ruptured compartments that eventually flooded overwhelming damage control efforts, causing progressive list until the destroyer capsized. Forward gun turrets were frozen, pointing skyward, the position they'd been in when the ship rolled. Depth charges remained on the stern section, still armed, still dangerous 83 years later. Japanese archaeological experts aboard Nautilus confirmed identification through hull construction, gun mount configurations, and dimensional measurements matching Teruzuki's specifications. The discovery brought closure to families of the 9 crew members who died, finally confirming the wreck's location and condition. Today, PT-617 and PT-796 are preserved in museums, restored to operational appearance, testament to the wooden boats that changed destroyer doctrine through one impossible night. The Packard engines are maintained, the plywood hulls carefully preserved, the torpedo tubes empty but still functional. Visitors can stand on decks where 20-year-old crews operated .50 caliber machine guns against warships carrying 100mm guns, understanding finally what courage looked like when mathematics said survival was impossible. In Iron Bottom Sound, 800 meters down, Teruzuki rests beside the wreckage of PT-44, steel and plywood together. Monument to the night destroyers learned that wooden boats with obsolete torpedoes and experimental radar could accomplish what admirals insisted was impossible. Commander Yasukawa's dawn assessment on December 12, 1942 had been correct. Plywood could sink steel. Speed and radar compensated for firepower and armor. And Admiral Tanaka's invincible Tokyo Express, which had sustained Japanese forces through 5 months of brutal combat, never recovered from the night mosquitoes killed a giant.